A magnitude 7.3 earthquake just hit the Mexico-Guatemala border, and it registered on seismographs more than 1,000 miles away in the western United States. That distant shake itself is completely harmless. What it happened to land on top of is not to stick with me for the next few minutes, because I'm going to walk you through exactly why scientists are watching California right now. On the morning of Friday, July 17th, 2026, the seafloor off the Pacific coast of southern Mexico ruptured. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck along the coast of Chiapas, close to the Guatemala border, with its epicenter roughly 30 miles southwest of the town of Cintalapa, at a depth of around 9 miles. The shaking was felt as far away as Mexico City and across the border into Guatemala and El Salvador, and it was strong enough that people in high-rise buildings in Tuxtla Gutierrez described the experience as terrifying, with residents evacuating down emergency stairwells during the middle of the workday. A tsunami threat was issued for coastal areas within about 180 miles of the epicenter, and lifted a few hours later once. Tide gauges confirmed the wave stayed small, generally estimated at somewhere between about 1 and 3 feet in height. As of the most recent reports, there have been no confirmed deaths, though a couple of injuries were reported in southern Mexico, and authorities in both countries have been checking buildings and infrastructure for damage while watching for. It's worth mentioning one small but genuinely interesting detail about how this earthquake was first reported. The initial automated magnitude reading came in at 7.4, and within minutes it was revised down slightly to 7.3 as more complete seismic data arrived from stations around the world. That kind of small adjustment isn't a mistake or a cover-up. It's exactly what happens with every large earthquake. The very first estimate is a fast, rough calculation built from the earliest waves to reach the nearest monitoring stations, while the final, more precise number comes from a careful analysis of the full waveform once it's been recorded and cross-checked by instruments spread across the globe. A tenth of a magnitude point might sound trivial, but on a scale where each step represents such a massive jump in energy, that refinement is the difference between a rushed initial guess and a properly confirmed measurement, and getting it right is essentially the purpose of the Global Seismic Monitoring Network. That number 7.3 is genuinely enormous once you understand the actual scale seismologists use. Each whole step up on that scale doesn't mean a little more shaking, it means roughly 32 times more energy released. A magnitude 7.3 isn't slightly stronger than a magnitude 6. It's releasing something on the order of tens of megatons of force, delivered not instantly, but through the violent slip of a fault that had been locked and slowly loading with strain for a very long time. That energy didn't come from anywhere unusual. It came from the ordinary, patient buildup of stress between two tectonic plates, stored for decades and released in a matter of seconds. If a real, verified breakdown like this is exactly what you want from a science channel instead of pure fear-mongering, go ahead and drop a like on this video, because it genuinely helps this kind of coverage reach more people. The way this earthquake actually broke tells you almost everything about where it happened. This region sits along the Middle America Trench, a long subduction zone running down the western edge of Mexico and Central America, where the Cocos Plate is sliding beneath the North American Plate at somewhere between roughly 75 and 90 millimeters per year, depending on exactly where you measure along that boundary. That's roughly the speed your fingernails grow, except carried out by a slab of ocean floor the size of a small sea. That motion doesn't happen smoothly. The two plates catch and grip against each other, and strain builds for years and decades until friction finally loses, and the overriding plate lurches upward all at once. That sudden lurch is the earthquake. This is the same general category of fault responsible for the largest earthquakes on the planet, the great megathrusts of Chile, Alaska, and Japan. Though Friday's rupture broke only a modest patch of that seam rather than the whole thing, it helps to understand exactly why this specific type of fault, called a subduction zone, tends to produce the largest earthquakes anywhere on the planet. The contact surface between two plates, one sliding beneath the other, is not a small crack. It's a vast, continuous boundary that can stretch for hundreds of kilometers along a coastline and extend deep beneath the surface. When a large enough patch of that entire contact surface fails at once, there's almost no natural limit to how much rock can move in a single event, which is exactly why subduction zones like this one, the same general family that produced the catastrophic 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and the 2011 earthquake off Japan, sit at the very top of the scale for potential earthquake size anywhere on Earth. Friday's rupture broke a comparatively modest section of that much larger boundary, but it drew energy from the exact and same underlying machinery capable of producing something considerably larger. In the roughly 30 minutes following the main shock, the largest aftershock struck somewhere in the range of magnitude 5 to 6, depending on which agency's reading you check, with additional aftershocks continuing in the following hours, some reports counting at least 5 to 10 events between roughly magnitude 5 and 6. To anyone on the coast, the cascade of aftershocks probably feels like the ground refusing to settle. To a seismologist, this pattern actually looks reassuringly ordinary. Aftershocks follow rules that hold up remarkably consistently across earthquakes worldwide. The largest aftershock typically lands more than a full magnitude below the main shock magnitude. You get many more individual events. That pattern is the signature of a fault settling into a new equilibrium, not a warning sign of something even larger still building underneath it. There's also a genuinely humbling piece of honesty worth sharing about how seismologists talk about the small tremors that sometimes precede a big earthquake. In this specific case, a couple of smaller quakes were recorded in the general area shortly before the magnitude 7.3 struck. And it's tempting after the fact to label those as foreshocks, early warning signs of what was coming. But in any tectonically active zone like this one, background seismic activity, small magnitude 2, 3, and occasional 4 level tremors, happens constantly on essentially any given day, whether or not a larger earthquake follows. Calling a specific small tremor a foreshock is, in an honest sense, mostly a judgment made after the fact, once you already know a larger earthquake came next. In the moment itself, a genuine foreshock looks essentially identical to the thousands of small, unremarkable tremors that lead to absolutely nothing. There's no reliable way to tell the difference in advance. You only find out which. Category A small quake belonged to once the ground has already answered that question for you, which is exactly why no legitimate seismologist claims to be able to predict the specific timing of a major earthquake based on preceding small tremors alone. It's worth being honest about why the resulting tsunami stayed relatively minor, because that detail tells you something real about the physics of the rupture itself. A tsunami isn't created by shaking. It's created by the seafloor physically lifting or dropping and shoving the entire column of ocean water sitting above it. A rupture that stays relatively contained or that slips more sideways than vertically displaces far less water than a true megathrust event that heaves a huge patch of seafloor upward all at once. Friday's earthquake, despite its genuine energy, didn't move the seafloor the way a true tsunami-generating giant does, which is exactly why the resulting wave stayed in the range of roughly 1 to 3 feet rather than something devastating. Before we cross over to California, it helps to understand what this particular stretch of coastline is actually capable of, because it has a long, well-documented memory. This specific segment of the Middle America Trench has produced numerous earthquakes of magnitude 7 or larger over past decades, and the largest of them was a magnitude 8.2 that struck the southern part of this same zone in September of 2017, Mexico's largest earthquake in a century, which killed close to 100 people and generated its own tsunami. That 2017 event was actually a different style of rupture than Friday's, an intraslab earthquake tearing deep inside the bending Cocos plate itself as it flexed downward into the mantle, rather than a rupture along the plate interface the way Friday's earthquake was. Same general trench, two genuinely different ways of failing. The reason that distinction matters is scale. A magnitude 8.2 releases something on the order of 30 times more energy than a magnitude 7.3. So Friday's earthquake is very much not the ceiling for this region. It's a reminder of a much higher ceiling that has already been reached within recent memory. If you're the kind of person who finds it genuinely interesting how one earthquake overseas can physically register on instruments on a completely different continent, drop a comment and let me know, because it helps me figure out what else is worth covering on this channel. Now here's the actual physical thread connecting the story to California, and it's a real measurable phenomenon rather than a loose metaphor. When that magnitude 7.3 ruptured off Mexico, it sent seismic energy racing outward through the solid body of the planet. Earthquakes radiate several kinds of waves, and the fastest, called a P wave, moves through solid rock at several miles per second. That wave traveled the length of the continent and registered clearly on seismograph stations out in the western United States, roughly an hour later. That's not exotic or unusual. Large earthquakes get recorded on sensitive instruments all over the world every single time this happens, and reading those distant arrivals is literally how scientists locate and measure earthquakes in the first place. The same network of instruments, sensitive enough to catch that distant Mexican rupture, also happens to be the network trained around the clock on the fault systems running underneath California. It genuinely helps to sit with what that actually means for a moment. An earthquake happening off the coast of Mexico physically shook the ground beneath the western United States about an hour later, and a sensitive instrument recorded that arrival as a clean, unmistakable signal. This isn't some rare or exotic occurrence. It happens every time a sufficiently large earthquake occurs anywhere on the planet, and it's precisely how the global seismic network is designed to function, catching everything from small local tremors to the distant echo of a massive rupture happening half a continent away. But it does draw a literal physical connection between two coastlines that most people assume have nothing to do with each other. even though mechanically the plates involved on each side are entirely separate systems, separated by thousands of kilometers of completely different tectonic boundaries in between them. To answer the question honestly, you first need to understand what California's faults have been doing completely, independent of anything that happened in Mexico. In June of 2026, a study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth, led by geophysicist Lilian Burkhardt at the University of Bern in Switzerland, working alongside researchers from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the United States Geological Survey's Earthquake Science Center, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, reconstructed. Roughly 1,000 years of stress accumulation across the southern San Andreas and neighboring San Jacinto fault systems in Southern California. Their finding is genuinely striking. Stress levels on multiple segments of these faults are now at or above the highest values recorded anywhere in that 1,000-year reconstruction. The study focused specifically on a location called Cajon Pass, situated northeast of Los Angeles, where the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems come close together. The researchers described this junction as functioning like an earthquake gate, a point that can either stop a rupture from spreading or, under the right stress conditions, allow it to jump from one fault system onto the other. According to the study, if stress on both fault systems rises to similarly high levels at the same time, conditions become more favorable for large rupture that crosses that junction and spreads through both systems at once, potentially reaching somewhere in the range of magnitude 7.4 to 7.8, and affecting a much larger area than a single fault rupture would, including Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and the Coachella Valley, home to millions of people. It helps to understand exactly how researchers built a model capable of estimating stress reaching back 1,000 years, since that's not something anyone could measure directly with modern instruments alone. The team constructed a physics-based earthquake cycle model, then fed it a reconstructed 1,000-year earthquake history built from independent lines of geological evidence, including radiocarbon dating of disturbed soil layers, tree ring anomalies linked to ground disturbance, and historical written records of ground ruptures where they exist. That model tracks how each individual earthquake in that long history changed stress on neighboring fault segments, how that stress slowly built back up again during the quiet periods between events, and how deeper layers of the crust gradually relax following a major rupture. Feeding 1,000 years of that reconstructed history into a physics-based model is what allowed the team to estimate exactly how today's stress levels compare against the full range of activity the region has experienced going back a full millennium, rather than only the relatively short window of detailed instrumental records available from the past century or so. If a detail like that surprises you, that scientists can reconstruct 1,000 years of underground stress using tree rings and radiocarbon dating, drop a comment and let me know, because it genuinely helps me figure out what other underappreciated research is worth covering. The single most stressed segment identified in the entire reconstruction was the San Jacinto Bernardino section, registering a modeled stress load of about 3.6 megapascals, higher than any value seen anywhere across that full 1,000-year simulation, and above its own previous peak from nearly 50 years earlier. Burkhardt explained that the raw number matters less than the scale it applies across. That elevated stress isn't a small, localized reading. It's distributed across an enormous volume of mechanically locked rock, stretching tens of kilometers along the fault and reaching depths of 10 to 20 kilometers. The neighboring Mojave South segment of the San Andreas Fault currently sits at roughly 2.8 megapascals, in the same model, also elevated, though not quite matching the San Jacinto Bernardino reading. It's worth adding some historical context here, too. The southern San Andreas Fault last produced a great earthquake. Back in 1857, the Fort Tejon event, estimated around magnitude 7.9, that means this particular segment has been quietly accumulating strain for roughly 169 years, longer than the average gap between its major historical ruptures. The plate boundary keeps moving a few centimeters every year, regardless of whether the fault actually slips, which means every additional year without a major rupture is simply another year of strain locked further into the rock. So let's answer the actual question directly, because a lot of speculation online gets this wrong. Can a magnitude 7.3 earthquake off Mexico actually load or trigger the San Andreas Fault from more than 1,000 miles away? The honest scientific answer is no. And understanding exactly why matters, because it's exactly the point where fear and physics genuinely part ways. There are two real mechanisms by which one earthquake can influence a distant fault. The first is called static stress transfer, a real measurable effect where a rupture permanently changes stress on the faults immediately surrounding it. This effect falls off extremely quickly with distance, generally only mattering within roughly 1 or 2 fault lengths of the original rupture, meaning tens of kilometers, not thousands. At the distance between the Middle America Trench and the San Andreas Fault, static stress transfer is effectively zero. The second mechanism is called dynamic triggering, caused by the passing shaking of seismic waves themselves as they roll through a distant fault system. This effect is real and genuinely documented, most famously when the 1992 Landers earthquake in California set off small tremors hundreds of kilometers away as its waves passed through. But dynamic triggering is weak. It tends to nudge fault systems that are already sitting extremely close to failure, particularly in geothermal or volcanic areas already full of fluid, and it typically produces only small events. It can jostle a system already sitting right at the edge. It cannot manufacture a large earthquake that wasn't already building toward happening on its own. It's worth spending an extra moment on why these two mechanisms behave so differently, since the distinction genuinely matters for understanding this entire story correctly. Static stress transfer works by permanently, physically bending and reshaping the rock immediately surrounding a rupture, similar to how pressing down on one end of a stretched sheet of rubber slightly changes the tension across the rest of it. But that effect weakens dramatically the farther you move away from the original point of pressure, becoming negligible within a relatively short distance. Dynamic triggering works completely differently, relying on the passing vibration of seismic waves themselves rather than any permanent shaping of rock, which is exactly why it can theoretically be felt at much greater distances, but why it's also fundamentally weaker and far less capable of producing anything beyond a small, minor tremor in a fault system that wasn't already sitting right at its own breaking point beforehand. So the honest, defensible conclusion is this: the Mexican earthquake is not a trigger for the San Andreas fault. It's closer to a coincidence in timing that happened to draw scientific attention back toward a genuinely serious, independently measured finding, that certain Southern California fault segments are sitting at their highest stress levels in 1,000 years, according to this recent study. That measurement, not the rupture off Mexico, is what actually deserves ongoing attention. It's also important to be precise about what this stress study does and does not tell us. Physics can measure how loaded a fault currently is. It cannot tell anyone the specific date or year that stress will actually release. That's exactly why seismologists consistently talk in terms of probabilities and elevated risk rather than specific predictions or timelines. A fault sitting at record stress could still take years or even decades before it actually ruptures, and no legitimate scientific study claims otherwise. What a study like this one actually provides is genuinely valuable information for emergency planners, building code officials, and infrastructure decisions, helping direct resources and preparation efforts toward the segments carrying the greatest identified risk, rather than functioning as any kind of specific forecast for when an earthquake will occur. It's also worth putting this single Mexican earthquake into a broader, calmer context, since headlines about earthquakes tend to arrive without that context attached. So far in 2026, the planet has produced roughly 9 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or larger, against a long-term average of around 15 per year, meaning this year is actually running somewhat below that historical average rather than above it. The largest earthquake recorded anywhere on Earth this year was a magnitude 7.8 in the Philippines. There has been no magnitude 8 anywhere on the planet so far in 2026. The world produces roughly 120 to 140 earthquakes of magnitude, 6 or larger every single year, something close to one every 3 days on average, which is simply the ordinary background rhythm of a geologically active planet, not evidence that something unusual is currently underway globally. So where does this honestly leave things? Off the coast of Mexico, the earthquake sequence is behaving exactly the way seismologists would expect a fault of this size to behave, with aftershocks decaying in a predictable pattern and nothing, in the data suggesting an imminent larger rupture along that specific stretch of trench. In California, nothing about Friday's earthquake changed the underlying physics. The Mexican rupture did not load the San Andreas fault, and there is no credible chain reaction traveling up the coast toward Los Angeles. What remains genuinely true, independent of anything that happened in Mexico, is that certain segments of the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems are currently registering their highest modeled stress levels in 1,000 years, according to a serious, peer-reviewed study published this past June. That's the part actually worth paying attention to, not because it predicts anything specific about timing, but because it represents real measured scientific evidence that these particular fault segments deserve continued monitoring, continued research, and continued seismic preparedness entirely on their own merits. If you want to keep following real, verified science coverage like this, instead of exaggerated claims dressed up as breaking news, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I'll keep tracking both this earthquake sequence and any further findings on California's fault stress as genuine updates arrive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.